I'm still here.
Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for day number 1 of the 2024 World Championships Swiss stage. It's the main stage of Worlds. Every single team has now entered. The play-ins are over. If you want to know my thoughts on how we got here, on how the play-ins ended up going, please check out the playlist up in the iCard. We've covered every single day of the play-ins. Of course, we did all of the pre-tournament coverage as well. We've covered all of the major regions, every single game, all year, so all of that stuff is on the channel if you want to check it out. If you want to see my power rankings before the tournament, they very much still apply to this stage. We've still yet to see a majority of the teams compete, but again, if you want to know my thoughts on how the Swiss stage, or the play-in stage, ended up going down, please check out those videos. But today, we get to start out on the Swiss stage, and boy, am I excited. These are when the best teams in the world jump into the action. We get to see everybody play here today. We all started 0-0, and so depending on the outcomes, we could change a lot moving forward. Some of these matchups are pretty predictable, some of them not so much, and I'm excited to go over it. But if you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. We've got a ton of games to get through, and so let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game on day number 1, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and of course, at the end of the day, we will be talking about day number 2, talking about the teams that went 1-0, the teams that went 0-1, and how that potentially affects their, I guess, tournament lives going into the future. Winning today is actually very, very important. It's not necessary, but it puts you in a huge hole to lose on day number 1. Having to fight your way out of an 0-1 start is really not ideal at a tournament like this where only 8 teams are going to get out of the Swiss stage. So big for every single team involved. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. We get to start with our first game of the Swiss stage. There is a hometown team in game number 1, but they are certainly underdogs because we get one of the tournament favorites kicking off the main stage of the tournament here, as we got the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming taking on the number 3 seed from the LEC in Mad Lions Koi. Mad, of course, making it out of the play-in stage, but they will not be starting this main stage 1-0. They will be going down 0-1 to start off this main stage. Bilibili is going to pick up the win here in the first game of this tournament, and that is not a surprise at all. This would have been a gigantic upset if Mad was actually able to pull it off, and at least for the first 5 to 8 minutes of this game, it looked like it was going to be possible. Some really, really great plays made in the early game by Elyoya and by Mirwin to be able to actually generate a gold lead for this team with the split map scenario. You send Cassante down into the bot lane. He outplays a 4v1 dive after his support already dies. Obviously, it's a little bit of a rocky first couple minutes for Mad Lions. We'll get to that in a second, but Mirwin actually gets strong because of it. Elyoya is pretty constantly in good positions and actually setting up his team to be in a pretty solid spot, but the problem for Mad Lions this game was just that the middle of the map was such an utter disaster for them. We will get to that in a second. Actually, we can get to it now because player of the game for me on Bilibili is going to go to Knight. It can't really go to anybody else in this particular performance. If you wanted to give it to Wei, I think that's fair. On, I think also is somebody that's an honorable mention for this, hell even been, just for surviving on the top side of the map, but really Knight was the focal point for where Bilibili wanted to put a lot of their resources, and who would have thought that Knight on Ahri ends up being a bit of a problem for Mad Lions. This guy's got a ridiculous win percentage on this champion. He was unbeaten throughout the entire year except for one game in the playoffs on this champion, so leading into like August, this guy was unbeaten on Ahri. It's just ridiculous that you would let this through in the first game of the tournament and that you yourself would opt into the Syndra Ahri matchup. I get that Frescowie has been playing a lot of Syndra. When you look at the play-in stage, that was clearly his most comfortable champion, the one that he wanted to opt into the most, but this is just not something you can get away with against BLG in the same way that you could against PSG or Viking Esports. It's not the same. Frescowie was fine in the play-in stage, but he was certainly someone that I was talking about not really having these great performances, and you walk in here to game number 1 trying to take this even matchup against Knight, and all of a sudden, you know, Knight's outplaying you, you lose your flash level 1 because you're overextended for no reason. Wei makes you burn it, and now Wei sees a Syndra with no flash, and you've got your best player on the team in the mid lane for Bilibili, and yeah, they're going to abuse that matchup over and over again, and Knight was obviously a big reason for that. But if you wanted to give it to Wei for that pathing, for making Syndra's life a lot harder, then I think that's fair as well. I just don't think it's quite as easy if Knight is not landing charm after charm and still going up in CS and pressuring Frescowie out of lane, even without a lot of the assistance coming in from the jungle. So Knight, to me, was that player of the game, but really putting their resources into the middle of the map is kind of what destroyed this game for Mad Lions. It really is what blew everything up. They were in an okay position, regardless of that. You know, if you take away the mid lane gold gap for a lot of this mid game, they actually were in a position to play out some of these fights, and they were winning fights around the grubs. It just didn't end up mattering. So credit to Knight, credit to Wei. They really stepped up here. I don't think Wei was like perfect in the early game. I think Elyoya actually did match him in terms of the pressure he was able to generate, but again, too much of a gold difference in the middle of the map. I do want to give credit to On, who I thought was really good on the rel. A couple of 4 or 5 man engages here. Now, a lot of them were in the late game when things were a lot easier. He did also int a bit in the early game, so you do have to kind of give that over to him. He'll do that sometimes every so often. We've talked about it in the power rankings before. There are times in the mid game where he's just over eager and over aggressive. We saw that around the Grubs fight, but overall he was fine. Elk was good, was targeted a lot in the early game by Elyoya because they needed to try to get gold somewhere, but still was fine. And Bim, talk about staying relevant despite the circumstances. Mirwin was basically gifted a free 2-kill lead onto the Gnar, and yet Bin was still arguably more active in side lanes, taking more time out of these plays that Mad Lions wanted to make on him, and not even really dying in the instance, only dying once throughout this entire game. This was a pretty expert weak side game from Bin, which you're really excited to see. He's not necessarily always known for being the most stable on weak side, so really, really great performance here from Bilibili Gaming. You're very excited to see that, and hopefully you can continue that moving forward. Obviously, you want to maybe see them be a bit more aggressive, like pre-5 or 7 minutes into the game. Having a gold deficit against Mad in that instance isn't ideal, but once you win one fight here, once you catch out like 2 or 3 members in the middle of the map, it's just genuinely over. You can't come back from that if you're playing against BLG. But for Mad, on the other side, we've already basically talked about it. Frescowie is going to get dud of the game. This Syndra was entirely useless, just absolutely no pressure in the middle, completely exposed and abused after losing Flash at level 1. There's just no way to play this out for the Syndra, and this is why you don't opt into this kind of matchup against Knight, against Bilibili Gaming. You have to take something that they're going to be at least a little bit more cautious to try to play into. I actually would have preferred if you sent the Syndra into the bottom lane, took the Tristana into the mid lane, and then tried to play that out, because at the very least, the Ahri can't be ridiculously aggressive into the Trist without somewhat being punished. You just have no punish with Syndra. There's a reason I don't really like this champion as much as everybody else in the current moment. It's because once she gets behind, she is like genuinely useless. She is very much just a numbers champion, and so you either blow people up or you don't do anything in the game. And so when you're the worst team, it's usually a pick that's not going to work out, and we saw that once again here. But like I said, I do want to credit Mirwin and Elyoya for a pretty good early game. Elyoya actually had some great pathing, and if he didn't get caught out in the middle of the map during that like 3v4 that ended up happening around 15 minutes, I actually would have said that his pre-20 was about as good, if not better, than Wei's, but it just didn't end up working out like that. And then Mirwin obviously outplaying the 4v1 in the bot lane to get 2 kills and survive is gigantic, but what did that lead actually amount to? Absolutely nothing. Mirwin did nothing throughout the rest of the game. Supa and Alvaro were along for the ride. Alvaro, another player who just kind of had a really awful game, lost his flash at level 1, and as the Alistair was just never in the right spot, constantly was getting dove. Just a bad game for the Syndra and the Alistair, and especially for Alvaro, who was so good in the play-in stage. But overall, Mad's going to have to turn this around. Obviously, 0-1 is not an ideal start, but it's not unexpected. Losing to Bilibili, one of the tournament favorites, not the worst thing in the world. I think Elyoya had a good game, showed a lot of signs of promise, showed a lot of ability to be able to fight against good teams. If they're able to, I guess, rally around that and maybe not burn 2 flashes at level 1, then perhaps we could be looking at a Mad Lions team that does better than expected. They were already really good in the play-in stage. But for Bilibili, nice way to start off your tournament. Hopefully you can take this momentum and keep carrying it, being one of the first teams to qualify for the quarterfinals. But then moving on to game number 2, and this is the game that we were all waiting for. The premier game of day number 1, the premier game of the start of the Swiss stage here. It's a battle between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Top Esports and the number 4 seed from the LCK in T1. Of course, two teams that are kind of tournament favorites in their own right, regardless of how they've played over the course of this year, and Top Esports is going to come out on top with the victory. Now, this shouldn't be surprising if you watched these two teams, especially over the past 2 months. Top Esports has clearly been the better of these two teams. They were arguably the best team in the regular season in the LPL. They just couldn't quite get the job done in the playoffs. Obviously, Bilibili was favorites over them, but losing to Weibo Gaming was certainly not an expected outcome for them. But regardless, they come to Worlds and they are able to pick up a big win in their first game here for T1. You definitely played a comp that had a lot of wombo potential. You have a lot of ability to combo Nico ultimate into Wukong ultimate into Rakan ultimate and really just CC layer onto Top Esports. And for one fight, it really ended up working out. You land that 5-man Nico ultimate, you get on top of the Jhin around the dragon, and all of a sudden things are looking really good for T1 being able to scale this out. But this is the problem with drafting something like Nico as a counter to Aurora. It's just you don't really have the prio, the damage, or the pressure in the later half of the game in order to be able to seal it. This was very close, a very well-paced game from both of these teams, but Top Esports just with the more clinical execution, which is why they are coming out on top. Player of the game is honestly super difficult because so many players on TES were really good, but I would be remiss not to give it to Jackie Love on the Jhin. You know, I got roasted a bit, I'll be honest. I definitely got a bunch of negative comments talking about how I put Jackie Love so high up in my top 20 list. I put him above someone like Viper. I put him above someone like Gala. I think Jackie Love is insane. Mako was my number 1 support on that list. He's my number 1 support in the world. I did get quite a bit of criticism for saying that Top Esports had one of the better bot lanes in the world, and so far so good on that take. Jackie Love comes out here in game number 1 and proves everything that I thought we knew about him. I can't believe that liking Jackie Love is such a controversial take in 2024, but this guy has proven over and over again that if you give him the opportunity, he's going to come up big. He's a very clutch player, and in pretty pivotal situations, he is the one that matters the most. When you talk about this big wombo engage comp, the big problem for them is that if they don't land their CC on the Jhin, well, now you've got a Nico, a Wukong, a Rakan, and a Jax all bundled up, and those bouncing grenades are just going to obliterate people. If Jackie Love's not hit by the Nico ultimate, he can just stand on the backline and just ult away and not have to worry about anything because his damage is so high. I really was not a believer in the static shiv here for Jhin, but man, did it absolutely work out. Jackie Love was terrific, but just talking about him would be taking away some of the credit from the players that I think really helped get him there. Tion had a ridiculously good game on the Skarner. He absolutely deserves player of the game here. The concern for Top Esports is that Tion, at least in recent years, hasn't performed well internationally. I think some people forget this guy's a former World Finals MVP. He is a world champion, and if he is in meta and comfortable with the way that Top Esports want to play around him, he can still be the best jungler in the world. He has that kind of upside. My concern was that he was going to be a bit greedy, but in fact, the greed this game really ended up working out because the patience in the middle of those greed plays ended up really kind of setting them all up for success. I think Cream was excellent this game on the Aurora. If Nico is your designated counter to Aurora, then you better hope you win early. You better hope that you get that gigantic gold lead, because if you don't, Aurora is going to be 10 times as useful, especially with this combo. You have Skarner and Rel pulling people into the Aurora ultimate. Now all of a sudden, this team is very difficult to deal with in a lot of different levels, and Cream obviously doing a billion damage in a lot of these fights. Aurora has looked so good at this tournament, and Mako, another player whose contributions you cannot undersell. He had 100% KP. He was constantly setting up plays for everybody else. He was pairing up with Tion incredibly well in these fights. He was starting everything, and for Top Esports, this really was a team effort. 369 had to take the brunt of a lot of the aggression, gets first blooded under his inhibitor turret at level 1. It just is what it is, but outside of that, he was fine this game as well. He actually was a really good frontliner in the back half of this game, so Top Esports just being really good. This is the kind of performance you wanted to see from one of the best teams in the world. T1 did show up today. Trying to say that this was the T1 that really underperformed is not the case. This was better than what T1 showed throughout the regional qualifiers, and Top Esports was still better than them in this game, which is a really good sign. For T1, I'm not going to hang my hat too heavily on this. Going 0-1 is certainly not an ideal way to start off this tournament, but Top Esports is a really rough draw. There's a reason this was the game of the day, but I think the flaws of this draft ended up coming up really big for T1. Faker is actually going to get my dud of the game. He hit one gigantic ultimate. I'm really not going to try to undersell that. He hit like a 4 or 5 man ult around, I think it was like 3rd, 4th dragon, one of those in the mid game, and it really set T1 up in a gigantic lead. They had a 4K gold lead at one point in the mid game here, but here's the problem with Neeko as a quote-unquote counter to Aurora. Aurora's big weakness is the early game, and Neeko is a very difficult champion to play around in the early game. Her damage is really high, her base damage is really high, but she doesn't scale particularly well. In the late game, she's basically an ultimate bot. She's not really going to deal nearly enough damage. She's certainly not going to be able to match Aurora in terms of damage, and so the longer this game goes, the more that you kind of index into these 5v5 team fights, the less damage T1 end up having. Who is supposed to outdamage the Jhin or the Aurora on this T1 comp? Like, you've got so much setup and so little follow-through. You have to hope that either the Ashe or the Jax are just ridiculously fed and have enough gold to be able to just blow people up, especially as a duo, but that just didn't happen. Faker was still able to land some ultimates in the late game, but Jackie Love was playing a lot safer, and when you're landing ultimates on Renekton and Skarner and Rel, all of a sudden, the Neeko has no value as a champion, and so Faker is going to get dud of the game because really, they were playing a 4v5. Like, this champion did not exist in some of the last team fights, and that's my problem with Neeko. I think she's very good as a support when you're not relying on her to be a primary damage dealer, but when you need her to deal damage, she just doesn't do that right now in the later half of the game, and so we definitely saw that problem. I do want to give some credit to some players on T1. I thought Zeus had a really good game. I mean, the tower plate monster was just taxing every single lane, walking through and getting tower plates the entire early game. He did have quite a bit of gold, but what is he supposed to do into a Jhin that is actively fed? Gumayushi was generally fine, I would say, throughout this game. Guma and Keria actually got a 2v2 kill on Jackie Love and Mako. It just didn't end up translating into anything, but Owner also really struggled. Wukong plus Neeko, again, very good setup. You have to have a follow-through, a hyper carry somewhere, someone that can deal damage on this team, and they just didn't have it. So even with T1 having good setups and relatively playing their own tempo and playing well, I would say Top Esports was just a little bit better in terms of execution. Now, if this is a best of 5, do things change moving forward? Probably. I don't think T1 goes back to a draft like this, and, you know, we'll see the kind of adaptations they make throughout the rest of the tournament, but at least for now, this is a gigantic win for Top Esports that really cements that they're not going to be the same kind of quote-unquote world's international underperformers that maybe they've been known for going into this. But moving on to game number 3, we've got another LCK LPL matchup with maybe the best team in the world getting their first Worlds game. It's the number 2 seed from the LCK in Gen.G taking on the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming, and I'd love to sit here and say that, oh yeah, Gen.G won the game and they looked great and they looked like the best team in the world, but that's not really what happened. Yes, Gen.G did win the game. You can see that up on your screen. Gen.G was able to pick up the victory. That was kind of a given, I would say, with this matchup. This absolutely should have been a win for them, but this was not a clean win by any means. This was a very, very tense game throughout basically the entirety of the mid to late game. You really relied on scaling when it came to Gen.G. It felt like this game was on a knife's edge for 35 minutes until things just broke open with Gen.G winning one crucial team fight after getting the Baron. That was really great from them, but Weibo put up a really good fight in this game, and honestly, the reason I'm not going to sit here and panic as much about Gen.G as maybe some of the other analysts will, or as the desk will, is because I do favor Weibo, like, a lot more than I think other analysts. I think this is actually a very good team with very good macro, and their mid game was terrific in this game. They just couldn't quite hang on. They got out-team fought by Gen.G. They make one mistake, staying out too long on the map. It allows Gen.G to get Baron and get out, and all of a sudden, the entire tide of the game ends up turning. Gen.G with this long-range, kind of suppression comp, just not allowing Weibo to really play the game from that point onwards, and the fact that they had a gold lead ended up not mattering, but Weibo was able to generate a pretty strong gold lead in the mid game, which I think is something to acknowledge. But let's talk about Gen.G, player of the game. Once again, kind of difficult, because I do think that it was more the team comp that ended up being, like, successful together than it was the individual players. People are going to complain how boring and how slow this team comp is, but I do think it kind of theoretically works for Gen.G's style. I think I very much considered giving this player of the game to Canyon in the jungle, because I just think the Maokai was so effective. Canyon was the one kind of initiating a lot of the plays they wanted to make. Oftentimes the threat of a Maokai ult by itself was enough to zone out Weibo Gaming and not really allow them to step up or try to play the game, which is obviously very big, but I ended up giving player of the game itself to Chovy. Just really nobody else I could give it to in terms of these late game fights. Yes, the Smolder had his problems and Chovy was not perfect in this game, but they had a win condition, which was get Smolder to 1 billion stacks. He ended up getting, I think, 400 plus stacks in this game and ended up getting Infernal Soul and just completely obliterated the game the longer it went on. When you get to those final fights, when they get Elder, it's just instantaneous, right? Smolder with Infernal Soul and then obviously Elder Dragon at the end of the game. It's literally unbeatable. And so for me, Chovy was the most important player in the game, if only because the Smolder was what Gen.G were kind of playing for, and the combination of Maokai plus Smolder ultimates coming through to secure towers and just side lane pressure across the map, it made it impossible for Weibo to continue to play the game, and generally that was kind of the trend for Gen.G when you look at this comp. Obviously, you don't have a lot of go buttons. You're hoping for Renata or Maokai to potentially be that go button for you, but if Weibo is going to play as safe as they did in this game, oftentimes you're just using Maokai ult plus Smolder ult, even sometimes Rumble ult to be able to just zone off everybody to scare Weibo away so that you can take a tower, so that you can take an objective relatively for free, and if you get those 5v5s, you just have to hope that you have enough gold on the Smolder to be able to make it work, and that's kind of what they did here again with some really solid macro and one really good decision, I'll say, in the late game. I do want to give credit to Keen here on the Rumble. One thing I do want to note on, I'm not going to harp on this too much because I talked about it a lot in play-ins, but people were talking a lot about how the meta has shifted so much, about how teams are definitely going to adapt and change. I wouldn't be so sure about that. Like, teams often default to the things that got them to the dance in the first place, and I don't think any of the champions in this game are particularly weak. I know people are really low on Rumble. I think Rumble is fine. He's basically what Kennen was for the entire year, which is an okay laner, somebody who has decent damage, but certainly not the kind of damage he had before, because that was nerfed, but can still obliterate a teamfight because that ultimate is still legit. Like, he is a teamfight bot in the top lane, which is fine if you want to neutralize the games, especially in a lane swap meta. You've got things like Maokai that are still very high priority. Smolder, I still think is very good, much weaker in the early game, but again, if you get to those late game breakpoints, you're still going to be incredibly strong. You know, a lot of the champions that everybody was talking about not being relevant at this tournament, they still are very relevant, and they're still able to pick up, you know, victories, and Keen was valuable in this game, especially in the back half. Again, his laning is not going to be as strong. That's Rumble's weakness right now, but if you can get him into the late game, into these 5v5s, Rumble still does a ton of damage, and so we're definitely going to see more of that. We got Randuin's Pays over the course of this. I think it was Randuin's GA, Kalista from Pays in this game. Very funny, was very willing to step up and actually be kind of the pseudo frontliner for this team for a lot of these fights because he was so aggressive in terms of his positioning and he was doing a lot of damage. Kalista's a fun champion if you can get to 6 items because she can just do a lot of different things. And then Lehens was fine. Some of the ultimates were actually kind of bad. Some of the positioning was actually kind of bad, but he salvaged it himself for the most part. Overall, Gen.G was good this game. Not great. Again, I want to see more from them moving forward. Weibo, I think, played well, but for the most part, taking this really passive, really scaling comp, it fits Gen.G's style, even if people aren't very happy about it. And then for Weibo on the other side, like, it's just hard, right? How do you play this game out? The moment that you give over that Baron, it becomes infinitely more difficult. You have to hope that Gen.G ends up making a mistake, which is very likely with a comp like this. If the Maokai or the Rumble or the Kalista or something just dives in for no reason, you can punish that really heavily, but Gen.G played out super calm, super collected. Weibo doesn't really have a chance to turn the game around, and they end up losing. Crisp is going to get dead of the game for me. A couple of picks in the early game keep Gen.G alive in this one. I think if he had not been picked off a couple of times early on in the game, perhaps we're looking at something different because Gen.G doesn't have any gold to work off of, but I also don't think the Poppy was particularly relevant in the back half of the game, even when you're looking at it going up against things like Kalista, which it's generally supposed to be very strong into. I think you're also looking at someone like Tarzan just not really having a lot of effectiveness in the back half. I love Ivern, but the later that this game goes, the less you can shield. I mean, it's a bunch of AoE, it's Rumble ult, it's Smolder ult, it's even Renata, right? You can only shield so many people if you're the Ivern, and so it's just a very difficult game to end up playing out. The Daisy was very important this game, 3-man knockup around the Baron pit, but outside of that, not really a ton going on for Tarzan. Xiaohu had a couple of great moments, a couple of bad moments, pretty traditional Xiaohu game, quite frankly, at this point. Light was okay, got a ton of gold in the early game because of the lane swap, but never really was able to do anything in team fights, and Breathe was excellent in terms of his positioning, just couldn't actually get enough damage off because he didn't have enough follow-up, but overall, this was actually a good showing, I would say, from Weibo. This was the team that made LPL finals. Like, you cannot discount the fact that this is a good team, but they played Gen.G's style instead of playing their own style. This is supposed to be the most aggressive team coming out of the LPL, and it just didn't show here. They played scared and safe, and unfortunately, that played right into Gen.G's hands, and they were able to take it. I want to see more from both of these teams moving forward, but somehow, some way, we ended up with the result we expected. But then moving on now to game number 4 and kind of our middle game of the day, or at least our last game of the first half. This is another one of the most intriguing matchups. We got a lot of them towards the beginning of the day. It's the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic taking on the number 3 seed from the LCK in Dplus KIA. And Dplus KIA is going to pick up the win here, but yet another back and forth game. We have not been disappointed so far on day number 1. It's been a lot of really close, really tight games, and it was throw after throw after throw in this one. Honestly, what you could have probably predicted from both of these teams, neither of them known for their macro, both of them kind of relying on just their pure skill and mechanics over the course of this year. Fnatic, very famously, it's Razork, Humanoid, Noah, like Oscar and Jun as well, but all of them just being really good mechanical players and being able to outskill a lot of the people that they're playing against in the LEC, but really struggling when enemy teams are able to pull them apart and out macro them. They're throwing leads at a ridiculous rate. It's kind of what they've been known for over the course of this year, but then you've got a team like Dplus KIA who's kind of doing the same thing over in the LCK. I am much lower on DK. I think they're the worst Eastern team at this tournament right now. I think that they are the weakest of any LCK or LPL team, and I think that kind of represented itself in this game where they probably shouldn't have been able to win it. They had a good early game, but once again, as is customary for DK, it's just mistake after mistake in the mid to late game that ends up collapsing their gold lead. Lucky for them, Fnatic was even worse in terms of some of the decisions they made and some of the mechanical decisions they made in the back half of the game, but they were bailed out in that front. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Showmaker. It just can't go to anybody else. This guy's poke is ridiculous. I mean, before every single fight in the back half of this game, somebody was at half health. Oftentimes it was Oscar, but sometimes it was Razork, sometimes it was Jun, Humanoid. Like, somebody was getting chunked out by the LeBlanc. It was so hard for Fnatic to set up for any of these objective fights, for Baron or for Dragon or for anything like that, because walking into River was just like half your health gone from the LeBlanc. I don't think LeBlanc is like crazy high damage right now in comparison to maybe some of the other mid laners or assassins in particular, right? But I do think that her safety alongside her late game damage is really good. When you do get to 4, 5, 6 items in a game like this, yeah, LeBlanc's gonna blow you up. There's just nobody in the game who can survive that consistently, and so Showmaker being as adept at that champion as he is, it made it very difficult for Fnatic to actually play and walk up to these objectives. But I do want to give a big shout out to Lucid for the early game. I know the Skarner had basically no impact on the back half here, which is why he's not in consideration for player of the game, but their first 15 minutes, they looked like they were going to completely dominate this. It looked like it was going to be a 20-minute stomp and that DK was just going to completely roll them over, and a lot of that was how good Lucid was in the beginning part of this game, how well he played out the beginning part of this, and so I want to give him credit for that. Even if the Skarner wasn't relevant in the back half, that's just generally what's been happening with Skarner. The later games go, the less relevant that champion ends up becoming, because short-range engagers just aren't very good right now unless you have a way to consistently be able to get in. There's really not a lot that Skarner can do to set up against, you know, Renekton or Rel or somebody like that, right? You're just hopefully Peel in the back half of the game. Aiming got a ton of gold in the early game and did absolutely nothing with it. I continue to be an aiming doubter, and he's done nothing but prove me right over the course of these big games. His scoreline looks okay, but like, genuinely, what was he doing? Like, he was like 4th most damage on his team in a lot of these team fights down the stretch. Just not a great game from him. Kingen was very good. I would say that he was actually sleeper very good this game. Some good plays, I would say, by Razork to be able to kind of poke him out, or even Humanoid at times to be able to pop the Mega Gnar before some of these big fights, but overall, just a good game for Kingen, but it was Showmaker. Like, at the end of the day, this was LeBlanc being able to kind of create everything that DK needed, and eventually Fnatic just threw the game away with a horrible Baron call, which we can jump into. A lot of people are going to blame Noah for this. I mean, obviously, Noah was the reason they were in this game at all. He was dominating a lot of the fights before the final team fight, but people are going to blame his mispositioning in that final fight. I'm not going to blame his mispositioning. I'm going to blame them being there at all, or even starting it in the way that they did. I think Fnatic threw the game away with that Baron decision. I think whoever made that call ended up absolutely losing them the game. The moment that they lose that fight and that they get aced, and, or I guess they lose 4 or whatever, you know, Oscar dies in base, so it doesn't really matter, but the moment that they lose that fight, the game is instantly over, and I'm just not sure what you're looking for there. Even if Noah is in a good position, you're probably looking at like a 40-60 in favor of DK. Like, I just don't really know what the idea is for Fnatic. Once Noah gets caught out, the fight is over, the game is over, there's no way to win it. But I'm not going to sit here and blame Noah entirely for that. I'm going to blame Humanoid, who's going to get my dud of the game, getting caught over and over and over again, mispositioning over and over again. There were some times where he was doing really well to follow up with Jun and create a lot of havoc. You know, Rel plus Yone can be very dangerous, and, you know, Yone is very strong. The casters were questioning blind pick Yone. I don't question blind pick Yone. There are very few champions that can genuinely match Yone's pressure, both in team fights and inside lanes right now, which is why I think he's very blind pickable, but you can't be out of position. You actually have to play the champion. That's the thing with Yone, is he's not a free auto win like some of the other, you know, Smolders or Zeris that have been dominant over the past year or so in the mid lane. Like, you have to be able to mechanically play him, and if Humanoid's going to make these small mistakes throughout the game and just constantly give DK gold over and over again, it's going to be a bit of a disaster. I also think Razork got less and less relevant as the game continued onward. Really did not like how he played Zyra when Zyra's supposed to be the strongest in the back half of the game. I don't think Oscar and Jun were the problem. Jun actually had a couple of fantastic engages, and Noah, again, was the reason they were in that game at all, even if he did make the game-losing error in the back half. But this is typical Fnatic. This is them just not understanding how they're supposed to win games, making the worst possible call to throw away the game when it matters the most. It's just what this team has been most consistent at. Their in-game shot calling and decision making is some of the lowest at this entire tournament, and they continue to prove that. And for DK, they're not a ton better. Like, they don't make perfect decisions, but their hands are so good that oftentimes they're able to get away with it, and lucky for them, Fnatic threw harder in this game. So credit to Showmaker, this guy's ridiculous, but both of these teams are going to need to level up. DK, I'm not expecting much from in the 1-0 bracket, but Fnatic, I think I'm expecting even less from now that they're 0-1. But then kicking off our second half of the day with another very fun matchup. I guess it's Worlds. It's a lot of fun matchups, but it definitely gets a little bit more predictable from here on out. But game number 5, we saw the number 2 seed from the LCS in Team Liquid taking on the number 3 seed from the LPL in Gen.G Esports. And Gen.G is going to pick up the win. This was, again, kind of a predictable result, but very similar to what we just talked about with Fnatic and with Dplus KIA. It took a little bit to get there. It felt like Team Liquid had this game in the palm of their hands, but it was sloppy execution that just completely obliterated any chance that they had. The problem is kind of the opposite of what it was for Fnatic. Fnatic, they just made some brainless decisions. Their macro was horrible in the back half of the game. They're going for things that are way too risky. They don't know how to make late game decisions, and they lose the game. For Team Liquid, they were making the right decisions. They were making the right calls. They just couldn't execute them. They actively were coming so close to being able to blow this game wide open on multiple occasions, and they can't actively finish it off. And a lot of it is just mistakes. It's mechanical mistakes. It's just misplays coming in from these players, and I think that's the most frustrating part. But for Gen.G, again, maybe not the most convincing game of all time, but I certainly think them sticking to comfort, playing well, keeping their cool in the later half of the game, even when Team Liquid was in an okay spot, is a really good sign from them. And player of the game kind of has to go to Gala. Jhin has been explosively good here today. Another take that I think I've done really well on over the course of this tournament is just being so high on Jhin. I think this champion just absolutely melts team fights. It's so easy for Jhin to completely take over, and we saw that the moment that he started getting gold in the early game, the moment they started playing through him because of the lane swaps at like 8 or 9 minutes, all of a sudden, Jhin becomes very difficult to deal with, and yes, there are weaknesses to Jhin. In a lane swap meta, he's not going to be able to take towers nearly as fast as a lot of the other AD carries. Yes, he's not got the fastest objective take in the world when it comes to Baron or Dragon or anything like that if you want to rush it, but in terms of fighting, in terms of like actually 5v5ing, I don't know if there's a better AD carry in the game right now than Jhin. He's just so strong in those circumstances, and Gala obviously functioned really well on him this game. Again, all he had to do was be in the backline and be able to output consistent damage. You have a comp on the other side with Team Liquid that we already saw kind of a similar one get bursted and destroyed by Jhin earlier today, because you have to clump up. Jax and Nico and Leona and Skarner, like a lot of these champions kind of have to be together in order to be doing anything, and Jhin can really punish that a lot more than other champions can. So credit to Gala, the Jhin was once again very big in this game. Weiwei and Scout, though, you do have to shout out. Zika in the top lane was another player that was exceptionally good. Again, I want to continue to die on this hill. Rumble is still very, very good in the later half of the game. I'm very confused because the commentators and the analyst desk, they seem to be saying the opposite. They seem to say, well, Rumble was nerfed in the early game, but, you know, if you don't get a lead on him early, then he's not going to be useful late. Like, you still need to be able to dominate on him early. That's why you're picking him. I feel like it's just a bad read of the meta, either that or it's just this lack of, like, adapting the thought process, because Rumble is no longer an early game champ. That's what the nerfs did, but his late game is still really good. The ultimates are still really good, and his damage is still very consistent in the back half of the game. We saw that here with Zika just being able to get onto the backline. If you are, Rumble's going to be able to blow you up, and his ultimates were phenomenal throughout this entire game. There was one in the bot lane where really felt like he was caught out and dead to rights, and Team Liquid had him. He got hit by the Nico ultimate, it was doomed, and then he drops an ultimate on 3 members, they get scared and they run away, and he ends up surviving, and you end up turning that into a 2-for-0 that lets you get Baron later on. It's just a really good play. Like, Zika was awesome in this game. Weiwei and Scout, like I said, were good. Scout had a couple of problems in the early laning phase, got his buffered by the Nico ultimate on the Tristana and ended up dying, but after that was basically perfect. People continue to shit on this Tristana pick. He did a lot of damage in this game. That champ can still very much function at a high level. And then Weiwei was awesome. Sejuani is the best jungler in the game. The fact that teams are prioritizing Skarner over Sejuani makes me want to pull my hair out. And so, you know, congrats to LNG. Hung was good as well. I'm certainly not trying to take anything away from the Rel. They hung in there. They kept their mental about them. They kept their cool, and they walked out of here with a win. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, it's just mistake after mistake. This game was not won by LNG. It was lost by Team Liquid. They had it in the palm of their hands, and they just couldn't execute. There's really nothing else to say. Easy dead of the game has got to go to APA. Not 1, not 2, but 3 different Nico ultimates that were completely whiffed throughout this game. There's just no excuse. I mean, I know it's nerves. I know it's them getting tilted throughout this game, but if that's going to happen, like, this team's not going to go anywhere. If they're going to get tilted in the middle of their first game at the World Championships when it's still in the palm of their hands after 1 or 2 mistakes, it's just over. Like, this team is doomed. There is no recovering from that if that's how weak their mental is, and so you have to imagine that it's got to get better than this, but, like, this was about the least encouraging performance you could possibly see from a player like APA, someone who already did struggle quite a bit at Worlds last year, was not particularly good at that tournament, was way better over the course of this year as a complete player, and just not really performing here in this first game. He's got to be better than this. I mean, this was just awful. Mistake after mistake. Again, fail flashing over that big wall in the bot lane during that fight to not catch out Gala. It's literally a game-losing play from APA. It single-handedly lost them the game. But Umti was also not very good. Like, his early game was okay. Skarner is just a champion that I think is crazy overvalued. Like, I like Skarner. I think he's fine in the meta right now, certainly as a pick to combat things like Sejuani and Maokai. I think it makes a lot of sense, but seeing it be B1 in a lot of these games, I just don't get it. Like, what does Skarner do that Sej doesn't do? He has a slightly better early game, and he's got a less consistent, more melee-focused engage. Like, Sej can do everything Skarner can do from range. So, like, I don't really get what the whole point of Skarner is, but whatever. Umti also just stepping up and dying for no reason. Kind of traditional Umti when playing from behind. One of the things that we forgot because Team Liquid was ahead so much in the LCS because of the lane swaps is that Umti is a miserable jungler at playing from a bad state. And so we're seeing that again here. We saw it in the finals and we're seeing it again here. It's LCK Umti all over again. Core JJ was often caught out, missing Zenith Blades, like just not ideal. Yon and Impact were fine. Yon's scoreline doesn't look great, but he was actually tagging a lot of people. He was, you know, a couple mana away from being like actually super fed in the early game. It's a really unfortunate set of circumstances. And Impact was fine, maybe not aggressive enough in terms of the Jax, but it's Impact. It's kind of been his entire career. Overall for Team Liquid, you have to be better than this. Mid-jungle was horrible. One of the worst performances we've seen at the entire tournament, including play-ins here today. They have to be better than this. If they're not, they're going to be a quick out at this tournament, and that's going to be a very disappointing showing for NA. And for LNG, it's a nice win, but as I've said for teams like DK, I just got to see more. I think this draft is fine. Everybody's sitting here and saying it's the draft's fault. It's not the draft's fault. I think their early games just need to be cleaned up. I think the thing that got them through here is the fact that they were able to stabilize and keep their cool, but if they can't generate early leads on their own, then they're going to be relatively doomed. And so we'll see how they continue to move forward, but having Scout here at all is already such a blessing. I think this team is going to be happy starting 1-0. Then moving on now to game number 6, and it's the #1 seed from the LCK making their Worlds debut. It's Hanwha Life Esports taking on the #1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon. And HLE is going to pick up the victory. Now, the stats don't actually look all that bad for PSG if you ignore towers taken and just general vibes of the game, but this is your classic major region versus minor region Worlds game. It cannot be more formulaic at this point how these games end up going. PSG drafts this really aggressive comp that actually ends up working out a bit in the early game. You have Gen.G playing super aggro. You have players like Maple and Betty actually getting resources early on, Maple in particular, you know, skirmishing a lot. You end up with a kill lead, but you look at the gold lead through all of this pressure that PSG is able to generate, through all of these skirmishes that they're able to win. and they're not able to generate a gold lead, and HLE continues to stay even, until one fight around the Rift Herald, all of a sudden, poof, the game is blown wide open. HLE is now 4k gold up, and the game is over. It's really sad. It's just kind of the way that things go in these kinds of matchups, but you can't say it's not predictable. HLE drafts probably the most formulaic Hanwha Live Esports comp of all time. Yone is ridiculously broken on this patch. I continue to stand by that he is the strongest champion in the game right now. I think Aurora obviously is another one that can be thrown out in that conversation, but I don't know if any champion is dominating quite like Yone is dominating right now, and Zeka continues to look really, really good on melee champions. Who would have seen that coming? He is going to get player of the game, but even things like the Gnar in the top lane for Doran, the Maokai for Peanut, his most played champion across all of this year, Delight getting his signature Rakan, like Viper's really good at Xayah. This is just such a comfortable comp for HLE, and it fits within the meta. This is just a slam dunk, like a home run of a draft, and Zeka is kind of the star of this. But once again, as we've talked about with a lot of the winning teams, it's not quite as simple as one player just being the best player on the Rift. I think Delight is the other player. Zeka and Delight were kind of the stars here. Even Doran, I thought, had a phenomenal game for HLE, but most of the plays they made were centered around the Yone, which is why I'm giving the nod to Zeka. I still don't understand why the desk continues to try to peddle this narrative that Zeka's some, like, average LCK mid laner that is, like, really good at Worlds. I don't understand. Like, at some point, people have to watch the games. At some point, somebody else has to be watching the LCK besides me, or you have to get somebody on that panel who has watched any of the LCK this year, because Zeka is just not that guy. This guy's been amazing across this entire year. He's been one of the top borderline 5 players in the LCK in 2024 so far, and yeah, he is going to get better at Worlds, but that makes him, like, debatably one of the top 5 to 8 players at this tournament in terms of maybe what the expectations are. He's going to dominate. I have a feeling this guy's going to pop off. It's the perfect meta for him. He's always been a really clutch performer. We saw that in the finals when he completely beat Gen.G, and generally I'm just really high on Zeka. This is just another kind of furthering of that case for me, but Delight looking exceptional. When you give him his signature Rakan, he's going to look really good. This isn't an entirely shocking development, but I don't imagine he gets that champion too much over the course of this tournament. Doran was awesome on the Gnar. Really loved his performance, especially in the mid game. He was generally just really well protected in the lane swap. I think when you're looking at the advantages that Doran had that Aja didn't, the ability to actually sustain himself in the early game during the lane swap was huge, mostly because of Peanut and because of his ability to play towards that top side, but also because of these really, really nice skirmishes from Doran that happened around that Rift Herald where things started to completely break open for HLE. He's so good in these mid-game skirmishes. Doran is also another player that continues to get underrepresented, although I do think, shout out to the casters, shout out to Hysteric, shout out to Azael. They did a really good job of kind of getting that across in this game where it's like Doran's very undervalued and underrated by the community. He absolutely is. He's one of the best top laners in the world. Full stop. He's top 5, no question. It's not even close. Viper and Peanut were also very good, but Zeka, Delight, and Doran definitely kind of the standouts to me. But for PSG Talon on the other side, they draft a dive comp, a really aggressive version of what they were playing in the play-ins with Sedge plus the double melee, the Akali and the Jax on the top side. You have the Kai'Sa, the Alistair. You have a lot of tools to try to dive into the backline here or to try and take advantage of a quote-unquote lane swap. The problem is that this doesn't really have a lot of use. There's not a lot of ways to play out this game if you're losing and if you're playing from behind, and it's so hard to consistently have a lead against HLE, and we kind of saw what happened throughout this game the moment that they got the, that they took their foot off the gas, that they kind of got the rug pulled out from under them, if you will. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Maple. Unfortunately, this Akali just didn't work out. Maybe it was really good in the play-ins when it was able to dominate a lot of players that are just not as mechanically good as Maple, but going into Zeka, especially Zeka's Yone, it's just a tough ask. This Akali did basically nothing down the stretch of this game, certainly didn't do enough damage to justify the pick, and generally speaking, a more consistent mage would have probably been really valuable in this game for this team, but you wanted to get that pairing up with the Sejuani. I like the idea behind it, it just didn't end up working out. That being said, Gen.G also completely fell off after the early game. Aja was completely taken out of this game because of the lane swap, whereas Doran kind of thrived because Peanut and, even Delight to an extent were shadowing him and making sure that he was in a comfortable spot and could actually play out that early game. Aja was basically left to die and was down like 40 CS, was really not in a situation where he could even remotely participate. This Jax, who was supposed to scale really well into the Gnar matchup, ended up being completely useless down the stretch because he just had no gold and no resources. He was an item behind everybody in the game, and that's really not a place you can be and actually survive. Betty and Woody didn't generate enough of an advantage because of that to really kind of justify it, and so you were really sitting here saying, okay, our win condition in the back half of this game was Kai'Sa and Jax. They were supposed to be able to carry us through the back half, and they were not in positions to carry. Betty was okay, but Aja was super far behind, and you're looking at a Fed Yone, you're looking at a Fed Gnar, you're looking at a Maokai, you're looking at a Xayah Rakan. Like, there's just not a lot of ways to dive onto here. And so, overall, I think PSG just had some general problems, and I think you drafted something risky and didn't get a big enough early game lead. But again, this neutral state was kind of a positive for you. I think PSG is a scary team for a lot of these 0-1 teams. I think they looked a lot better today than a lot of the other teams who ended up losing, or at least a lot more together. And so we'll see. Another thing to note, this is something I've talked about a lot this year. People hype up the grubs, man. Almost every single team that has gotten more grubs today has lost. And I don't know what the idea behind that is, but that has been like a running trend. Like, it's not like obviously a majority or anything like that, but probably 30% of the teams who get more grubs end up losing the game. That's like a genuinely statistically significant number. Like, it's not nothing, and so it's certainly going to be something to continue to monitor, but I've been saying it all year long, the stats on grubs really aren't all that good, and the teams that prioritize them often don't do nearly as well as the teams that prioritize dragons, or generally just overall map pressure, so we'll see if that ends up lasting, but outside of that, HLE looked awesome. This is exactly what you would expect from the LCK #1 seed. Maybe you wanted to see a more dominant early game, but I understand with the way that these, comps are constructed, how the early game can maybe be a bit more neutral, but to be able to maintain your gold consistency throughout and then just have one fight completely break it open and then end the game as soon as possible, it's a very good look for HLE. But then moving on now to game number 7, and it's time for the North American champions to step on the world stage for the first time this year. It's the #1 seed from the LCS in FlyQuest taking on the #1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports. And FlyQuest is going to pick up the predictable victory. If they had lost this, I would have lost all faith in North America. 100 Thieves already bows out in the play-in stage for the first time in North American history. Team Liquid really sloppily loses to LNG earlier on in the day. I think for North American fans, if FlyQuest had lost this, that would have been the end of all hope. I think at that point, you're probably just saying, we actually really suck right now. A lot of the progress that we had made over the past couple of years is completely erased, and we have to start fresh next year. But we've averted that disaster with a win here, and obviously there still are concerns when it comes to North American teams internationally. GAM is probably the weakest team in the main stage, at least in terms of expectations. Actually, I would say probably the second weakest, because Pain is here as well, but GAM is not exactly the biggest opponent in the world, and so FlyQuest beating them certainly isn't a surprise, but them just completely out-macroing and just out-tempoing them after a really good draft, I think that is a really good sign. Player of the game simply has to go to Bwipo. There's genuinely no one else that I could possibly give this to. I've never seen, I can't say that. I was going to say I've never seen Bwipo Sion look like this, but Bwipo Sion has been very good in the past. It's not been particularly consistent. There are games where it's just not good at all, and there are games where it's unbelievably good, and this was one of the latter, which is a really good sign. Bwipo has sometimes struggled to stay consistent when he's weak side like that, especially in the lane swap meta, but I think something like Sion is really kind of underutilized in this meta, not specifically Sion, but just a big, meaty tank, something that is very difficult to kill. We're seeing a lot of low damage comps come through right now, especially with mages coming back into the mid lane, things like Orianna and Syndra. If you're pairing that up with something like a Jhin, like, it's going to be difficult to break through tanks. Nothing there really breaks through tanks all that easily, and especially when you're looking at this draft, when you see Akali, when you see Jhin, when you see Gnar, there's nothing on this team that's ever going to be able to break through a Sion. They just got really lucky that it ended up being Mountain Dragon, and that also kind of compounded that, but look at all of the early game stuff that FlyQuest had. They were down a kill. GAM ends up getting first blood in this game onto Easy Love after a pretty decent dive down in the bot lane with the lane swap, something we've become very accustomed to, but Bwipo misses no minions. He ends up getting basically all of them because of Sion passive into immediate teleport back right down in there. He basically loses nothing for getting dove, and they can't do it again. It's not like they can redive him after spending all of those resources doing it in the first place, and so really not a lot lost there. And then after that first blood, it was just macro play after macro play. It's taking gold away from KIA, basically making his life a living hell on the top side of the map, whereas Bwipo is actually dominating elsewhere. KIA ends up being down on the bot side a little bit later, teleports in and has to really stick this out, and what does Bwipo do? He just just pokes him out under tower and basically forces his flash in order to not trade 1-for-1, because Bwipo basically always wins a 1-for-1 trade as a Scion. He just completely takes over the mid game. The Gnar is taken out of the game entirely. Even the Vi, to an extent, was taken out of the game entirely. And then when you look further along, Jhin gets first blood, but like, what's he supposed to do the rest of the game? He can never kill Scion. When you see an Akali, what's she supposed to do? She can never kill Scion. And so Bwipo just ends up completely taking over after what is kind of a macro masterclass in terms of the mid game from FlyQuest. And this is the version of them that we wanted to see. And he's actually been a really good region in terms of macro over the course of this year domestically, at least in my opinion, as I've evaluated it on this channel. I think they've made a lot of good decisions domestically. I think Team Liquid got very tilted, very nervous on stage, and so we didn't necessarily see that. Teams like 100 Thieves were never particularly good macro-wise, but FlyQuest should be a team that is able to out-macro a lot of the other like mediocre teams at this tournament, teams like Dplus KIA and LNG, let alone a team like GAM. And so to see them go out and actually execute it, it's just a really good sign. Inspired, going to the Ivern that he really dominated on towards the back half of playoffs that he basically won a trophy on. I love Inspired on Ivern. I think it really complements this comp a lot because it really kind of dissuades a lot of the quote-unquote dive potential that you have on the other side with things like Poppy, Vi, and Akali. You don't really have the ability to actually follow up on any of those dives because the moment that Redemption comes out, that Ivern shields come out on top of the Kalista or on top of the Orianna who can shield as well, there's really no way to actually execute any of that in the later half of the game, and so it ends up completely shutting down a lot of the ideas that GAM want to go for. Quad and Masu were great. Masu in particular played these team fights excellently. His growth has been very noticeable. I think he's played the best league he's ever played over the past like month and a half or so, which is a really good sign. Busia was very good on the Leona. Overall, just a great game from FlyQuest. A very well-rounded game. Really, really good macro and good execution in the back half. They didn't take too long to end it. This was just a great game, and this is the kind of game that I think North American fans needed after earlier today. And then for GAM, kind of what we expected, if we're being entirely honest. Maybe you would have thought that this would be bloodier, because Fly is sometimes known to be a little bit more chaotic, especially the top side of the map, can be a little bit more feast or famine, and we know that GAM is very willing to try to take a lot of these skirmishes, but they just didn't really have the opportunity to. We already talked a bit about it, but it's a pretty big draft gap in this one. You're never really breaking through Scion, Ivern, and Orianna as well. Like, you're never really getting Akali or Jhin to be able to ever break through them, and you don't really have enough damage outside of that. We are seeing a lot of low damage comps in the meta right now. I talked about it a bit earlier today when it came to T1. It's a problem. I do think you need to draft someone that can deal damage, and typically speaking on the FlyQuest side, I would kind of say that that is the same, at least in the mid-game. Kalista's not necessarily this mid-game dominator, but if you get her 3 or 4 items, then yeah, Kalista can get back to where she is at 1 item, right? It's a little bit of the curve, and so, you know, I don't believe in this draft. I don't believe in drafting Akali into Ivern. I really don't believe in drafting Akali into Orianna, which was the decision they ended up making, but it is what it is. GAM ends up moving down 0-1. KIA is going to get out of the game. I already explained a bit why, but was just completely taken out of this. This Gnar was entirely useless. Not only was he losing in the lane swap, as he is expected to do, but the moment that lanes went back to relatively normal, that the top laners were against each other, he was still getting completely taken out by the Scion, basically forcing 1v1 trades and forcing flash at any given opportunity. KIA just had a miserable game, and he is so integral towards GAM's success. He is by far the most important player on GAM, and so for him to be taken out of it, there just isn't a lot to do. Nothing else to really talk about. Levy couldn't do anything. Elio couldn't do anything. Emo and Easy Love, obviously already talked about, couldn't do anything. It's just one of those games where there's just not a lot of answers. And so credit to FlyQuest. They looked excellent. GAM, hopefully you can bounce back in the 0-1 bracket, but it's guaranteeing that there will at the very least be one Western team in the 1-0 bracket, which is a pretty good thing here for Fly. But that's going to bring us to our 8th and final game of the day here, of day number 1 and of our 0-0 stage. Another one where I think you can predict the outcome, but the debut of the hometown number 1 seed. It's the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports, taking on the number 1 seed from the CBLOL in Pain Gaming, and predictably, G2 is going to be able to run this. I said in the previous segment that GAM and Pain are obviously the underdogs in the Swiss stage, but Pain even more so. GAM, you know, the VCS, they're pseudo on the same level as a region like the PCS. They regularly are able to get out of play-ins. They're not, you know, a region that you would expect to completely unfold. Obviously, a lot has happened to the VCS over the last year or so, but generally speaking, I would say Pain are definitely the underdogs at this tournament, left at the very least in the Swiss stage, and G2 are not underdogs. This is a team that has expectations of going far beyond just the Swiss stage. They end up missing the quarterfinals last year. They want to rectify that mistake this year. And this was a really good step number one towards getting there. This was a great win from them. They're able to just come out and dominate Pain. This game was not close in any particular way. Credit to Pain. Again, I think that they did have an idea of what they wanted to do. They draft this really late game comp. You don't really have any options in the early game. You draft Aurora, Maokai, Smolder as kind of your top side. Now all of a sudden, you've locked yourself into this position where if you get rolled in the top lane, or if they draft something that is super aggressive or very engage oriented, now all of a sudden you don't really have a ton of outs. And lo and behold, that is exactly what ended up happening in this game, with G2 drafting the Wind Brothers in the solo lane duo, as Azael comfortably put it. The Yasuo in the top lane, the Yone in the mid lane. I think both of them are in very good states right now. The reason I haven't talked a ton about Yasuo on this channel is just because I think Yone is a bit better at the role. I don't really think there's any reason to pick Yasuo so long as Yone is available, but why not both? You definitely can get away with playing both at the current moment so long as you have your AP damage source somewhere else, and drafting things like Brand that Yike has played a ton of over the course of this year, I think is a very, very good alternative, and we saw these two absolutely decimate Pain in this game. Broken Blade is a very easy choice for player of the game on the top side. He's played a ton of Yasuo over the course of his career. I remember going back to North American days, like TSM days, he was playing Yasuo all the time as kind of the primary carry on that team for a lot of it. People forget how much he was kind of the primary option for 2020 TSM, but he went over obviously to Schalke and he was still playing Yasuo. He's played it less here on G2, I would say. Still plays it every so often, but certainly not as much a part of the game plan, I would say, for G2 as it has been in the past for some other Broken Blade teams. But we know he can play this champion at a high level, and he did here. He absolutely dominated. Yasuo looked incredibly broken, and maybe my analysis is wrong on him. Maybe Yone isn't just the better version of Yasuo. Maybe Yasuo actually offers a lot more than I'm giving him credit for, especially when champions like Yone are taken off the board. When you're talking about bans, if you want to go for something like that, Yasuo looked very good here. Now, part of it is playing against Pain Gaming, part of it's playing into Aurora, who just has no way to stop anything that Yasuo wants to do in the early game, and obviously you're playing into Maokai, you're playing into Smolder, you're playing into this really slow comp, and Yasuo is just basically free to do whatever he wants in this game, which is never ideal. But also, it's Broken Blade playing it, who's one of the better Yasuo players in the world, mechanically speaking, and so it's hard to really get an idea of how good the champion is, but boy, did it look good in this game, and I think G2 was right to go towards it. But Yike, the other player that I think deserves a massive shout out in this game on the Brand. Brand, not a champion that people are all that excited about right now. I understand why. I think AP junglers rightfully have lowered in priority. I've been talking about how tank junglers are just more consistent. Things like the Maokai, the Sejuani, and the Skarner, I think are going to get you more consistent success than things like Brand and Zyra over the long haul. Maybe Nidalee, I think, could kind of bridge that gap if you're good at the champion, but only if you're good at it. But Brand can still be very successful. You can still take these power farming AP junglers and make them work, especially when you're basically given first blood. It looks like Yike is caught out. He's not. He ends up getting first blood, and he actually is very active in the mid game into trying to make sure that both the Yasuo and the Yone and the Jhin, to a lesser extent, are involved in basically every plane. It starts snowballing the game out of control. The macro from Yike this game was tremendous. He's apparently in great form in Champions Queue right now. That very much reflected on the stage. I thought Mickey had a pretty fun game. Some really awful plays mixed with some really fantastic plays, and that's just kind of the Mickey dichotomy that you have to live with. I've been talking about how Mickey's actually been kind of a hindrance for this team over the course of this year. You have to take the good with the bad. At least there was some good in this game. You'll definitely take that, but the bad moments, they're just impossible to weed out when it comes to his gameplay at the current moment. Caps and Hans were good as well. Caps didn't have to do all that much on the Yone, but Hans was excellent here on the Jhin. Overall, G2 looked very comfortable with this comp, and we'll see if this is something that they want to move towards more so in the future. Brand is obviously something they've wanted to prioritize, and getting an aggressive topside is actually very valuable for someone like Brand, so we'll see. I think it's definitely going to be on people's radar for now. But for Pain, they just look exposed. Like, there's really nothing else left to say. Mechanically speaking, they're just not on the same level as G2. Actually, in these fights, they were okay, but generally speaking, the macro of this team is just an absolute disaster. This was something we were worried about going into the tournament. They didn't really have to worry about it all that much in the play-ins because look at the teams that they ended up playing. They really didn't play any teams with good macro outside of PSG, who basically trolled that entire draft phase, and so it's really hard to take anything away from that, and they still lost in that series. Their macro is just not particularly good, and when they're getting pulled apart in 5 different directions throughout the entirety of the early and in the mid game, you're just losing so much gold and so much tempo that there's really no way to recover regardless of how well the fights are going or how strong Dinkato is on the Smolder. Karayok is going to get my dud of the game here in the jungle. The Maokai just did not end up working out. Karayok was a player that I was not super enthused about going into this tournament. I actually had him ranked as the number 20 jungler at the tournament, the last ranked jungler including play-in teams at the tournament, and That did not live up to expectation in the play-in stage, but this was more of what I saw on tape, where he's just like in the wrong place at the wrong time and not necessarily playing along with the rest of his team. This very much felt like regional and domestic Karaoke rather than what we saw from him in the play-in stage. So we'll see if that ends up continuing, but Weiser, he was awesome in the play-in stage, didn't really get to do anything here. Curry and Titan, not necessarily active at all. Dinkedo, again, got a ton of gold on the Smolder, a lot of it donated to him in the early mid-game, but I mean, what is he supposed to do? The rest of his team melts like butter in a lot of these team fights, and the moment that any bit of CC lands onto him, he just dies to the Yasuo anyways, and so, you know, it's just not really an ideal set of circumstances. Pain was just completely outplayed here, and honestly, I would be surprised if this doesn't become the norm for them throughout the rest of this tournament. They're going down to the 0-1 section, which is winnable. Like, there are a couple of teams in there that I think they could compete against. A team like GAM would be a miracle draw for them. I'm not sure how realistic or possible that is for them in terms of, like, options, but it certainly is something to consider. But Pain definitely has an upward battle if they want to try and even get a win, I would say, in this stage. But for G2, they look good here. Again, they're joining FlyQuest as the only two Western teams in the 1-0 side. That's good. This team has expectations higher than that, though. Not only do they want to make the quarterfinals, this team wants to win Worlds, and I don't think it's like... I think it's crazy. I do think it's crazy to imagine that they could do that, but could they get to semifinals? I think it's a relatively realistic thing to ask if everything were to go right, if they get a good draw, etc., etc. Right now, this team is still very inconsistent in my mind, but this was a very good showing. All right, but that is going to do it for day number 1 of the Swiss stage here at the 2024 World Championships. Our main stage is one day closer to being done. I know that's a weird way to look at it, but we've now got a much clearer idea of where these teams are going to be moving forward. The draw has happened, and you can see it up on your screen. We'll talk about it in a second, but remember, you only need 3 wins in order to get yourself into the quarterfinals. That's a guarantee of at least 1 best of 3 along the way, obviously, depending on how things end up working out, and 3 losses is, of course, elimination from the tournament, but we're definitely getting closer to understanding which teams are going to be favorites moving into the quarterfinals, which teams have a very good meta read, and which teams maybe aren't going to be quite as successful as maybe they were domestically, or maybe who are living up to expectations in a negative way. Like I said, we do have our draw. You can see it up on the screen here. Of course, the 1-0 side is going to be the teams that won, because it's Swiss stage. All of the teams that won play another team that won, and all of the teams that lost play another team that lost. We'll quickly go over the 8 matchups, and I'll give my predictions on who I think is going to win those matchups, but you can probably kind of guess from my takes across this video so far. We'll start with the 1-0s. G2 taking on Hanwha Life Esports was the first one drawn. This is a bad draw for G2. Hanwha Life should absolutely be the better of these two teams. If G2 wants to be the team that they say they want to be and that competes to win Worlds and can go to semifinals and all that stuff, they have to win this, or they have to prove that they can at the very least hang with Hanwha Life. I think if they can win this, if they can get to 2-0, that's going to be gigantic for their chances at moving forward. I say that, although it didn't necessarily work great for them last year, but HLE are big favorites going into this for a reason. And then you've got DK taking on FlyQuest. This is a dream draw for both of these teams. I think they are likely the only teams across from each other that both of them could end up beating. I think DK, very weak for a 1-0 team, and I think FlyQuest is the weakest 1-0 team, and so I think theoretically either team could come out on top. I would expect Dplus KIA to be better because I think Showmaker is just going to be better than Quad, and that throws a big wrench into FlyQuest plans. But if Inspired can have a really good game into Lucid, which I certainly think is possible, or I don't know if Weibo can play as well as he did today into Kingen, anything can really happen. This is a winnable game for FlyQuest, which is not something I thought I was going to say after they went 1-0. And then you've got probably the matchup of the day, Gen.G taking on Top Esports. This is a matchup between two of the best teams in the world. Gen.G, to me, is the best team in the world, which is why I'm picking them, but Top Esports looked better on day number 1 for sure. I just have too much faith in Gen.G to overlook them. I think their slow style matches up very well into TES, who is very greedy. I think that, you know, if Gen.G plays that macro-oriented style, they're going to punish Tion and Top Esports in general for a lot of those greedy plays that they're going to end up making. But if Top Esports wins, I'm not going to be entirely surprised. We already saw that at the Esports World Cup. Then we've got Bilibili taking on LNG to close out the 1-0s. This is another pretty simple prediction. Bilibili should be better here than LNG. As much as I like LNG, they didn't look all that great on day number 1. They just barely got past a Team Liquid team that was shooting themselves in the foot over and over again, and I don't really have high expectations for them at this tournament. BLG are tournament favorites for a reason, or one of the tournament favorites for a reason, and I think they should be able to get by. So that's Hanwha Life, DK, Gen.G, and Bilibili that I'm expecting to move to 2-0. DK being 2-0 would certainly be a surprise for me, but with the way that the draw ended up working out, you know, they got a pretty good draw. You know, 2 Western teams is pretty nice for them. So that's my prediction there. And then for 0-1, we've got the Giga Banger matchup of T1 taking on Pain Gaming. I hope this one is fun. I'm glad to see that Pain gets to play against Faker. I think that that's a really cool storyline, but T1's going to blow them out of the water. This is not going to be particularly close. Even with T1 kind of struggling in recent weeks, I don't think Pain has the firepower to keep up with them or their macro. We've got a rematch from the play-ins here. PSG Talon taking on Mad Lions Koi. In the play-ins, Mad Lions was able to pick it up, and I don't really see any reason to predict otherwise. This was a pretty concrete series. In the play-ins, I don't think PSG has gotten infinitely better since then or anything like that, so I think Mad Lions should be picking up the victory here, sending PSG to 0-2. And then we've got the brutal draw, Weibo Gaming taking on Team Liquid. This is worst-case scenario for Team Liquid. I think Weibo Gaming is better than them. I think that they are probably the best team in 0-1. I mean, T1, obviously just kind of a toss-up between Weibo and T1 in terms of who you think is better. I think they're very similar in terms of teams right now, but either way, it's brutal for Team Liquid to have drawn them in 0-1. This is a team that I think had expectations going into this tournament, and a lot of those expectations probably just kind of went out the window. They're going to be the best team in 0-2, but I would be shocked if they picked up a victory against Weibo Gaming. And then finally, we've got Fnatic taking on GAM. This is very winnable for Fnatic. As much as I like GAM and as much as I think it was really cool that they went 4-0, they got destroyed by FlyQuest, completely out macroed and completely exposed, and I don't really see any reason to believe that Fnatic can't do the exact same thing to them. I don't think Fnatic is quite as good as FlyQuest. I said that in my power rankings video, but they certainly are comparable enough to where I think they'd be able to take them down. So for 0-1, I have T1, Mad Lions, Weibo Gaming, and Fnatic picking up victories. But let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down below, and that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We're going to be posting about every single day of the World Championships, and then, of course, the off-season after that. So every Swiss stage, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals, all of that stuff, it's going to be on this channel. If you enjoyed today's video, you're going to enjoy the rest of the content. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.